We're reading from Matthew 26, starting at verse 57 on page 71 of the Matthew Gospel. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered, and Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last, 2 came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and struck him. And some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?"
What I'd like to do this afternoon is to begin with a little revision. We've reached the halfway point in our series, considering Matthew's presentation of the crucifixion of Christ. And our contention is that Matthew is our teacher. Matthew was trained by Jesus to be our instructor. He is, if you like, the church's theologian. And in his seminary, he has carefully ordered the material on Jesus' death so that from this authoritative source, we can have clarity on what the death of Jesus means. You may have noticed, if you've been with us over the weeks, that at the heart of each major section, there is a saying from Jesus that unlocks the meaning. Jesus did not want us to be ignorant. He didn't want us to be speculative or to be left guessing as to what his death is about. We have also noted the significance of the Old Testament. Jesus did not appear in a vacuum. He appears in, if you like, a well-established grid of meaning and understanding. And because the Old Testament establishes a prior framework of what's going on, what things mean, as Jesus fits into that in fulfillment of it, so it brings real clarity and certainty concerning the death of Jesus. And so far we've seen, as we've charted from the beginning of chapter 6, the eternal value of Jesus' death. Way back there, page 68, Jesus says in verse 12, "In pouring this ointment on my body, this woman has done it to prepare for me a burial. Truly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has been done will be told in memory of her." In other words, Jesus' death is going to be proclaimed across the whole globe, and it is the most precious thing imaginable. But then we've seen the redemptive power of Jesus' death. Just as the Passover lamb back in the Old Testament, Exodus 12, secured the rescue of God's people, so too Jesus' death as a Passover sacrifice is an act of rescue. And in the Passover meal, he breaks the bread. "This is my body, take, eat." Profound significance. Similarly, we've noticed that Jesus' death enables a covenant or a relationship between God and us. Again, with allusion to Exodus chapter 24, Jesus says, "Drink this, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins," so that the death of Jesus establishes a relationship, a contractual relationship between God and his people. And then we've seen what we call the wrath-satisfying nature of Jesus' death. You'll remember that he pleads with the Father, "If it be possible, take this cup from me." And the cup, an allusion to Isaiah 51, Jeremiah 25 is the cup of God's wrath. It has to be that. And so Jesus' death, he drains the cup of God's anger at human sin to its dregs. And then finally, last week, we saw that Jesus went to his death as a willing sacrifice. He, as it were, walked in the narrow channel deliberately to his death, the channel of his Father's will. Any moment he could have called 72,000 angels to his rescue. He chose not to. And so we've been working with this summary statement, and here it is. If you're taking notes, it might be helpful to jot this down somewhere. This royal death is a willing, wrath-satisfying, sin-bearing, substitutionary sacrifice. This royal death is a willing, wrath-satisfying, sin-bearing, substitutionary sacrifice which secures his people's rescue and enables a relationship with God. Well, now we just had the reading of our new passage for this week. We could focus, I guess, there are a number of characters on any one of the characters. So there's Peter. And did you notice in verse 58, he was following at a distance? Well, we could have a whole talk on that, couldn't we? Following at a distance. We'll come back to that. We could zoom in on Caiaphas, the crooked Caiaphas, who presides over this kangaroo court, the high priest, who is the malevolent power behind Jesus' conviction. And again, we will come back to that in a moment. We could examine the council or the Sanhedrin, all of the Jewish elders, a number of whom hastily assemble in order to secure a guilty verdict at night. And we could spend time on the contemptible mockery, the slapping in the face, the spitting. But I want us to focus particularly, again, on these key words of Jesus in verse 64, which take us to the heart of the matter, and then towards the end of our time, we'll come back to the particular individuals on stage. So verse 63 on page 72. But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said, you have said so, but I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, I've given this part of this talk the title, The Crowning Glory of Jesus' Death. Jesus in the dock, the crowning glory of his death. The task of this so-called court, hastily convened, was to find a verdict that was credible to the Jews and which would ensure that the Romans put this criminal to death. We're not told how long they sat for. It certainly appears to have been a lengthy affair. They had to go out and search for witnesses, and it seems it took some time to find anybody who was prepared to provide false testimony. Verse 59, the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. They were seeking it, an ongoing affair, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, they identify two. Verse 60, the second half of it, at last two came forward and said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. Now, their testimony, though useful, is not adequate, especially so because of the prisoner's silence. Verse 63, but Jesus remained silent. Now, that silence itself is a fulfillment of Isaiah 53, where the servant of God, whose substitutionary sacrifice was to carry God's anger at sin, was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and like a sheep before its shearers is silent, and so he opened not his mouth. Frustrated, Caiaphas then binds Jesus under oath to the living God, and now, because he's bound under oath to the living God, Jesus is forced to answer. I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus' initial response, "You have said so," is slightly hard to get to grips with, isn't it? Does it mean, well, yes, but not quite in the way you suggest? In a sense, yes, but not quite in the sense that you're suggesting it or understanding it. And then Jesus spells out what Caiaphas should understand concerning his true identity, and how and when Caiaphas and his cronies will from now on see Jesus. Jesus said, "You have said so, but I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Now, that statement is a direct reference to Daniel chapter 7, and so we need to examine Daniel 7. And on your sheet there, on the back of the notice sheet, there is an outline of the talk, and under point 1, I have had printed out Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. "I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. He came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed." Daniel 7 is the central prophecy in Daniel's book. It is climactic. It matches chapter 2, Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 match one another. And in Daniel 7, it's as if a curtain is being drawn back on the control room of the universe. Daniel's vision is delivered in Babylon at a point when Jerusalem has been destroyed and all of the people of Israel have been exiled with the temple ransacked and removed into modern-day Iraq or Babylon. Notice the title given to the character involved there in verse 14. "Behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man." He takes the form of a human. He has the appearance of a man. He's taken on flesh. Notice the universal nature of his rule. He came to the Ancient of Days, was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. And notice that the duration is stressed 3 times. At the end there, his dominion is an everlasting dominion. It shall not pass away. His kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. In other words, in all the rotating carousel of Babylonian emperors, as kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall, as empires come and empires go, as presidents are elected and presidents are overthrown or impeached or wherever it happens to be, there is going to be one ruler. And Daniel is shown a vision of this ruler coming to the Ancient of Days, that's the God and creator of the universe, and being seated at his right hand and given dominion over all nations, all peoples, all languages, for all time. Now, there's no equivocation here, is there? There's no restraint here, no qualification, no balance. For Jesus to take the words of this prophecy and to use them like this at his trial in the kangaroo court of Caiaphas is to go to the most provocative extreme end of all power claims and to throw down as a gauntlet on the table before the council a challenge. It must have been electrifying. I wonder myself whether he said it quietly, slowly, deliberately, whether he shouted it. "You have said so, and I tell you, from now on." This is a claim to absolute and eternal, to universal and supreme power over every individual who has ever lived and ever will live for all of eternity. From this point on, from the moment of Jesus' death, and it seems to me that is one of the most striking parts of the statement, where Jesus says, "From now on." That this eternal, universal, supreme rule begins from now. That his wrath-satisfying and sin-bearing substitutionary sufficient sacrifice in his death is the point from which his rule is now inaugurated. And the reaction of the high priest demonstrates that we must have understood this rightly. Look at verse 65. Then the high priest, we're in chapter 26 of Matthew, then the high priest tore his robes. I take it in rage, in horror. He just grabbed hold of these thick robes and just rent them apart in horror at the blasphemy that has just been made. Well, we're used to rule being established at the ballot box, and the Americans are about to spend billions on it. From the history books, we know that rule is sometimes established through raw military might. But these three words from now on insist that Jesus understands his rule to be inaugurated by his death and resurrection. That his death and resurrection is going to inaugurate a rule for all eternity, where he is given position as king and Lord over every individual who has ever been born onto this planet. From this point in AD 33, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. What reign begins with the death of its monarch? This bound criminal, about to be mocked and spat on and beaten and humiliated and then nailed to a cross, is as it were, making his way up the Mall, across to Westminster, into Westminster Abbey for his coronation. Now, this is precisely how Jesus understands it. And just for clarification, again, we've been in the Old Testament, we've now been in Jesus' words. For a few more kind of triangulation points to tie ourselves right down to make sure we've got it right, turn to the very last page of Matthew's Gospel. Here is Jesus following his resurrection on page 78 there. Verse 18, Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." And we could go further. You know, this is precisely how the apostles understood it. In Acts chapter 2, Peter delivers the first sermon of the Christian church. Well, it's probably the second, but anyway, he delivers a sermon to the gathered assembly. "Let all the house of Israel know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you've crucified." Later, the Apostle Paul, "God raised Jesus from the dead and seated Jesus at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule, authority, power, and dominion, above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the age to come." So this is how Jesus understood it. It's how the apostles understood it. It's how the church has always understood it. And is it not a good and glorious thing that on the throne of heaven, as a result of his death on the cross, God the Father, the Lord of all power, has placed the Lord Jesus, that the one who has given his life as a wrath-satisfying, sin-bearing, substitutionary sacrifice for the sin of humanity is enthroned? That on the throne of eternity over every human being who has ever lived and ever will live is the Jesus who is good, selfless, kind, who gave his life as a redemption to pay for the sins of men and women. His death is his crowning glory. We're used to history being divided BC and AD. Of course, Anno Domini, doesn't mean after the death of Jesus. It means the year of the Lord, the year of his reign. So that year 34 is the year of his reign, year 134 is the year of his reign, year 220 is the year of his reign, 1220, 2020 is the year of his reign. Of course, we could go in any number of directions with this, how this contrasts with the public understanding of Jesus. I'm reading, I know it's fashionable just at the moment in time to bash the poor old BBC, but I'm reading this book on the BBC called The Noble Liar by Robin Aitken. It really does bear reading. It is quite chilling when you read it. Robin Aitken was a correspondent with the BBC for 25 years, and he's produced this book. One chapter entitled Auntie the Apostate, Losing Her Religion. And he charts the way that the BBC has been engaged in a deliberate suppression of Christian truth, not allowing the true claims of Jesus to be made clear for people to hear, but rather undermining the authentic Christian faith, and indeed presenting falsely images of Islam such that there's been nothing short of a kind of national censorship. It explains the kind of banal waffle that we heard this morning from the Bishop of Manchester in Thought for the Day. But you see, Jesus doesn't just claim to be one on a par with all other religions, or one like any other prophet. His claim is that he has been given all authority, all power, all dominion over every language, every tribe, every people. 1.4 billion people in China, 44% declaring themselves non-religious. Jesus Christ is Lord of every one of them. 28% declaring themselves simply to be Chinese. Jesus Christ is Lord of every single one of them. 1.3 billion in India, 74% declaring themselves to be Hindu. Jesus Christ declares himself to be Lord of every single one. However, at this stage, Matthew doesn't comment a great deal on this. Instead, I think we are meant to notice what Jesus says right at the end of this statement. So I'd like you to look again at verse 64, because it is a very intriguing statement, and so much is packed into it. First of all, you have said so. Then, from now on, and finally, coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, if you're able to multitask and you take hold of the Daniel quote, you'll notice that in Daniel, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days. But Jesus takes that part, coming on the clouds of heaven, and puts it at the end of his statement rather than at the beginning. In other words, he is now enthroned. That has already happened. We're living in the year of the Lord's reign. But you will see him not only enthroned, but coming on the clouds of heaven. Coming, that is, in judgment. Coming in judgment on the council. Coming in judgment on Caiaphas. Coming in judgment on the false witnesses. Coming in judgment on all of humanity. And that, of course, changes everything in this courtroom. Jesus in the dock, the crowning glory of Jesus' death. Caiaphas on trial, the coming judgment of Jesus' enemies. You see, things are not quite as they seem in this courtroom. In the dock, we have a bound prisoner. In the house of Caiaphas, we have a crooked counsel, a biased judge, and a kangaroo court. But we should not imagine that Caiaphas holds the reins of judicial power in this scene. Jesus does. And from this moment, in the year of the Lord's reign, every rogue ruler who challenges the authority of Jesus is precisely that, a renegade rebel. Caiaphas will see him enthroned and now coming to him in judgment to overthrow him. And whether it's an atheistic author or a biased broadcaster intent on censorship, or an anti-Christian state, or an HR department, or whatever it happens to be, from now on, those who side against Jesus Christ will find themselves meeting him in judgment. Nor should we imagine that those who bear false witness against Jesus will stand. Their very false witness, you see, is achieving his crowning glory. He's entirely in charge, and from now on, they will see him enthroned in power and coming on the clouds in judgment. And we know that every 2 or 3 years, false witnesses arise, and Waterstones is full of their material as some bright thing or other announces that Jesus was not crucified on the cross, or his body was swapped, or that we can't trust the Gospels, and so on and so forth. Well, Jesus sits enthroned, and from now on. Nor should we imagine that the contemptible actions of the council described in verses 66 to 68 will be seen as anything other than what they are: utterly, utterly contemptible. They answered him he deserved death. They spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ, who is it that struck you?" Those who deride Jesus or treat Jesus with disdain, those in your office who use Jesus' name as a swear word or even just as an exclamation mark, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And back to poor old Peter, who followed him at a distance. Nor should we imagine that Peter has made the right decision. Remember him? Peter was following at a distance. And as we realize where Jesus is, who Jesus is, enthroned in power, that decision to follow at a distance, what a mistake that was. How uncomfortable following at a distance is. How unsatisfactory. How then should we respond? Well, we should know where Jesus is today. He's enthroned at the right hand of all power. He's been given rule and dominion. He's coming in judgment. We should know what will happen at our death. Well, we will meet him in judgment on the day we die. He's enthroned in power. All nations will serve him. We should enthrone him in our hearts, in our homes, in our offices, in our business life, our private life. He is enthroned. Allow me to lead us in prayer. How we thank you, our Father in heaven, that you have given to the Lord Jesus this position of supreme power, how he deserves it. And we thank you that he and he alone holds the reins of power, and he alone will come again in judgment. We thank you that all that is so evil about humanity will be overthrown and done away with once and for all. We pray that you would help us in our own little lives to enthrone Jesus as Lord and King, to embrace the forgiveness that he offers us, and to live joyfully under his rule. For your name's sake. Amen.